So we're going to talk about digital, but especially as it relates to boards of directors and executive committees, and a little bit about the future.
You're looking across not just the technology roles, but all the different roles across the business that Gartner serves. How is digital showing up, not just for the CIO, but for all the roles that we support across the organization?
I was thinking the other day that the digital story for Gartner is almost a decade old now. Yeah. And it started, as a technical conversation. What does digital mean in terms of automating the business and those kinds of things? But over the last 10 years, it's very quickly grown out to all the other roles we serve. Whether you're a CFO or you're human resources, doesn't matter what the role is, you're thinking about how does digital impact my function? And even to the extent of incorporating digital into products and building different revenues and so on. So it's really, really widespread. And I think that knowledge is a really powerful thing. And of course, what we're looking at now is, well, who leads that? Is it everybody? Is it one person? We don't know yet. We're kind of trying to figure this out.
Well, say I'd like to get into that, but let's start with a bit of where we are on the journey. So clearly, some companies and some industries have leapt ahead, and others might be slower to adopt. But overall, what would you say about where companies are in general on their digital journeys after a decade of investment?
So there's this concept of the trough of disillusionment that comes with the hype cycle that we use. And I think a lot of companies are there, where they've been expecting maybe more transformative effects from digital. What they're seeing are optimization effects, which are still very valuable. But what they're hoping for is something that actually fundamentally changes the business itself. What makes that hard are more cultural things than technical things, whether the business is ready to move in that way and make those types of changes. But in the work that you do, you're working a lot with boards of directors these days. So you're seeing that from a different angle. What do you see from that side of the equation?
Well, one thing we see, and we're looking more closely at this right now, is that boards are meeting more often.
Oh, okay.
And so not just during COVID, when you would expect that they would be getting together because they were in crisis management
So not just
mode.
Once a quarter signing lease agreements and stuff.
Not just once a quarter. We've heard that some boards have moved to monthly. And that could be a variety of topics. But the pace is increasing, and the need for the board to fulfill the role that they fulfill in the organization is becoming something that's more present. It's maybe less of a regular mandated cadence. And they're rolling up their sleeves and they're looking at the business. And one of the places they're doing that is around digital, because more boards see that companies can be not just optimized, but also transformed with the application of technology. But actually doing that is very hard and very complicated. And frequently it doesn't fall on a single leader or a single initiative. These are company-level initiatives that are team sports, and boards are looking more and more closely into that.
So it's interesting what you say about meeting more frequently, because many things have accelerated. I mean, in the board of directors survey that we do from a couple of years ago, it said, in the face of the pandemic, we're going to speed up. We're going to take on more risk, and we're going to invest more. And so then part of the meeting cadence has to do with, okay, we've taken on more risk. Let's keep talking about it and keep an open conversation. I'm seeing the same kind of thing at the executive committee levels as well, is that even in the face of impending recession, they're saying, we're going to move faster. We're going to actually do more investment and take on more risk in order to do that.
For a lot of organizations, the stakes are going up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would say at the board level, we notice the pace is increasing, and we'll see if that continues, and we'll see what kinds of things. Cyber, obviously, is a big driver of a lot of board conversations. But the other dimension of that is, how do boards talk about digital by whatever definition?
And it used to be kind of buried within the audit committee sometimes, right?
Right, which is by design a backward-looking function, because you're looking at historical financial data.
Right.
But how do you have a conversation about future competitiveness only looking at backward-looking data and only in committee? And this is the feedback we get from many of the directors that we work with one-on-one and in groups, that while these conversations are happening, maybe it's not the right conversation in the right place with the right people and skill sets in the room. And skill sets at the board become a bigger and bigger issue, actually.
So are you seeing skills being remixed on the board? Are they hiring a different profile into boards these days?
They're beginning to. Okay. So I think that there's a feeling that if there was ever a feeling that boards were staid and stable, that continuity remains important. But I think there's a broader recognition that boards have to recompose themselves so that they can really provide thoughtful and experienced guidance on today's topics. And with technology being such a fast-moving space, current skill set becomes a big deal. So what you see on boards is, first of all, very simply, a growing number of boards are hiring as a board member a business leader, but with a technology background, a former chief information officer, chief digital officer, the CEO of a tech company. A growing number of active top technology leaders are joining boards even while they're in their current organizations, which brings another dimension to it. Now, that hasn't become general yet, but it seems to be growing, and it's a secular trend. The other thing we see is the formation of tech committees on boards, which are not legally mandated. So you have an audit committee and a compensation committee. These are in every board. Tech committees are always formed because the board decides it needs to take a special focus, but everyone is a little bit different, and they could be looking at different things. So even just having a tech committee and, say, a tech-savvy board member that you've brought on actually, and we hear this again and again, in no way guarantees that you're talking about digital at the right level. And that's an ongoing struggle for many, many boards, even boards that have tech-savvy directors signed on at this point.
So you're dealing with executive directors. I'm dealing with executives on the executive committee. And of course, there's interaction between those two groups.
Yeah.
In the executive role, what I'm seeing is maybe a bit more parity of digital skills than we see at the board. And that may be because newer people are being hired into role, but also they're responsible for designing the enterprise. And digital is just at the heart of that right now. And what's interesting is that everybody has a piece of that leadership. They have money, they have budget for building digital technologies into their products, for example. And the CIO still has a role of making the backbones, the platform upon which the business runs. Sometimes that person can evolve into a more progressive digital leadership role, sometimes not. Sometimes it's somebody from the pure business side of the house that comes in and takes that digital responsibility because they have vision. They have a vision for what that could mean for the evolution of the organization. And so it's a very interesting time to see the whole executive committee kind of lit up around the promise of digital, but also the difficulty of digital. Because there are things they want to do that aren't that easy. And so they're having to figure it out as a team, how to actually make that work.
Well, so this is the question that was on my mind while you were talking. So things are happening at boards and on executive teams to move in the right direction. And yet you started by saying that we have 10 years of digital investment and largely optimization successes, not necessarily transformation. In fact, transformation, we can come to this, has become a bit of a dirty word that companies shy away from for a variety of reasons.
Well, transformation should be difficult and rare.
There you go.
Because you're actually opening up the business model and making fundamental changes to who you are as a business. That shouldn't be easy, and it shouldn't be that common.
And this might be related to the trough of disillusionment, because it seems like digital transformation as a term, it has some real meaning and can be quite impactful. But I think at this point, for many executives and board members, it might even shut down the conversation more than enable it, because it's something that's been marketed.
Well, it's been marketed. The other thing about implementing digital in transformative ways is it takes a long time. I mean, the numbers that we see, it takes on average about 7 years to kind of hit your stride in becoming a more of a digital company. And we don't have patience for the next quarter most of the time. And so there's the best leaders are able to cultivate a strategic patience over a long arc and show results along that way. But say if you're doing something even like with machine learning, it takes time to build a body of knowledge, to build the models themselves, and then to work them in the real world. We're talking 2, 3, 4 years to actually do that. And so part of the executive committee's role is to understand that for themselves, but also to communicate it to the board, that things take more time perhaps, but with good results at the end of that story. Something you said about budget and the movement of money and who's doing what work and how is it aligned. What we're seeing is a pretty aggressive movement of money towards the lines of business for digital spend. And that is different from the money that goes to build the backbone. And we're seeing it accounted for in different ways. So one is SG&A, the other is cost of goods and services. And the more you see digital being accounted against COGS, or cost of goods and services, the more higher up the value chain it is. But it has structural implications too. It means there's a separation of concerns. Who's doing what type of work and why? So if I'm the CIO running the backbone of the organization, I'm creating high performance compute, I'm creating data services, I'm creating APIs that can be used by the line of business that then takes that and then builds higher value, sort of customer-oriented or value-oriented things on top of that. As long as you understand that sort of separation of concerns, you can work together more effectively. So there's an architectural, a structural element to this. And in the best companies that I see, they've figured this out and govern it as a whole thing.
And one bit of very strong feedback we're getting from the board directors is when you look at that tech spend component, if, say, a CIO or whoever the empowered leader is around that investment budget goes to the board and does an incredibly dutiful job walking through all those investments, the board still does not consider that a success. It's not what they need to hear, actually.
And so thinking about both the board and the executive committee, maybe out 3-5 years, how do boards look differently? How should they be functioning differently? What should they be thinking about on that time frame?
It's a great question. I think that probably the biggest change that has to happen, and this is a change that will not happen without intention, is that boards need to move beyond their current structures, which are very mature practices and necessary. So they perform all their things all their tasks in a very orderly way. But all of that does not sum up to the meaningful conversations they have to have about the future of competition and investment, how the executive teams execute. So I think they need to build structures that allow them to bring some pieces together, to expect that that's going to happen. And I think one avenue for that is that the conversation about technology investment just has to become one with, and a supporting element maybe of the conversation about business investment. So the good news is you go from a concept of digital as something that needed to have a light shined on it. But now all we're talking about is business strategy, business practice, business investment.
And digital has just become just part of that
digital
fabric.
Just melds into the fabric in a highly meaningful way. It doesn't mean it becomes less important. And it doesn't mean that 10 years of investment didn't do what it should have done. The world spent years laying fiber in the ground that wasn't used. But once it was needed, it enabled everything that came after it. And that's how companies, I think, should think about their digital investments to date. Not as something that, to your point about the trough of disillusionment, maybe we're in the trough of disillusionment, but don't think that those investments were in vain. Maybe they prepared the ground for all the things you can do now, but aligned action and the right conversation between the executive team and the board are really going to determine the path in a lot of ways. And if those don't happen, you can be almost certain that you're not going to get the result. How does it seem from your perspective?
Well, when I think about the future of digital generally, it needs to move from discussions about discrete things like discrete technologies or approaches or strategies, and more to an integrated view of how those things work together. So if we're talking about digital kind of fading just into business strategy, it just becomes part of how we work. That's a good example. We're not calling out the digital as a discrete thing. Same thing could be true with what often people are attracted to, like metaverse or blockchain or these individual technologies that come up. Much less interesting than what happens when they come together. So that's one. So moving from discrete to integrated. The other thing that we've learned coming through the human catastrophe of the pandemic is that we need more humanization actually as part of our strategy. And the next 5 years will be about sort of a recalculated relationship between technology and people, where people are being empowered by the technology they're using. And that has to simply become more integrated into how they work and think.
Where do you think companies are today on planning for that future and realizing that future?
It's mixed in terms of planning. A lot of it depends on honestly charismatic leaders that have a vision that people understand and want to be part of. That's not sector specific or industry specific or geographical. It really has to do with the culture of leadership in the company itself. So you have a leader that is telling a story of the future and how you can contribute to that. It's much easier to actually move in that direction as a whole. And that's the kind of leadership that I think we need today as we head into the next 5 years.